I say a little later on that I'm a chronicler, an elegist, a dissenter, all of the above. I was born in 1947. My mother died last year at 98. I wanted to really record a particular way of living as a person of color, as a person taking great pride in being in this haute bourgeoisie, as my mother once very wisely said when I said, "Are we upper class?" because someone had asked me this at school. She said, "Well, we are considered upper class Negroes, we are considered upper middle class Americans, and there are many white people who just want to consider us more Negroes." So, I wanted to capture all of those distinctions and negotiations and certainties at the same time that uncertainties were going on everywhere. Just always identity being confronted and confounded. So, I wanted to get the rituals of a world that still exists, but that not in the same way. And that's why I had to use that word. And land, by land I mean literally the geographical boundaries that we all know perfectly well in a city that have to do with class, ethnicity, race, but also that sense that we were bordered on one side by the larger world of blacks, on the other side by white people, some of whom we knew, most of whom we didn't. Also, a land is a mythic space. Anyone who's had to leave their homeland, knows that it's in your heart and in your brain, and it shapes your unconscious as well as your conscious. So I wanted that sense too. And this is not just the way I grew up or when I grew up. When you belong to a group that is discriminated against, whose value is always being debated. You can be black, you can be all manner of things, you can be a woman. Some sense of protecting your reputation is always there because you're always contemplating and confronting how a stereotype might jump up and hit you and finish you off, or how you might embody a stereotype. So you're taught to be very careful about saying or doing anything that gives prejudice, as we used to say, or bigoted people ammunition. And part of that is you don't tell family secrets that aren't flattering. Family in the sense of your people as well as your immediate family. But I thought that could be, as a writer, an interesting tension for a memoir, because I was also interested in what a memoir can do that's full of in conflict almost with, I'm telling my story. I almost called this, the subtitle was almost a cultural memoir, because it is the story of a culture and the story of an individual, a personality within that. If it were a novel, I'd have been the lead character. Absolutely in this dramatized and reflected upon context. I had a huge shelf of books. The most direct were several several books of history on the so-called black elite. They had various titles. I had books on Chicago history. I went back to, I think it was an Ira Berlin book on, I think it was called Masters Without Slaves. It's about blacks in South Carolina, the privileged class, many of whom were, not many of whom, but some of whom were slave owners. So, I was ranging over general black history, sociology. There were certain texts I knew I had to take up. Of course, you have to take up Du Bois, the double consciousness and the talented tenth. So there's certain sociological texts have to take up E. Franklin Fraser, black sociology. I read etiquette books, manners books, to remind myself of these rules and regulations. I read about housing, you have to cast your eye in many, many, many directions. And, it makes you anxious because I'm thoughtful, I have a scholarly streak, but I am not, a formal scholar. My training as a critic helped, because I'm used to going in a lot of directions for something. But that chapter, the history chapter, took a long time because I wanted it to be dynamic but not drab, but not simplistic. That also interested me in terms of a memoir, the form of it. How many personae are populating the page? But also, it seemed honest to the double and sometimes triple identities that I was confronting. And all, again, I keep using the word negotiations. And there's that triptych also of class, race, and gender, and you have to change your position and your tone and your literary strategies. The two things that really stay in my mind, the neighborhood that we lived in for a good part of my childhood. I was in Chicago. I was increasingly aware of what I wasn't calling, but of what was the half of the block that was very, quote, respectable, and the other half of the block that was starting to, as my parents saw it, slip down. And I write in the book about being very interested in the girls at the downward side of the block and wanting to play double dutch with them, and then, these little conflicts, and then after a little fight with them, overhearing my parents saying, I think we're going to have to move. This neighborhood is changing, that kind of thing. Yeah. Also, this is not an unpleasant memory, but I registered it often when we all took trains in the 50s. How many of you remember you would take trains often? And I remember at the train station, the red caps, many of them but their children were among my father's patients. So they would, hello, hello, Dr. Jefferson. They were not ingratiating, but, there was, yes, my father was being gracious and they were being maybe a little deferential. So I knew I didn't see it as a chasm at that moment because it was not unpleasant, but I knew there were distinctions. My grandmother owned several buildings, and they were hard won, my mother's mother, and she would collect the rent herself, and I once went with her, and she was very peremptory with one of the tenants. I don't have the rent this way. I'm really not interested in what you don't have. So it was, oh my God. And then I had to go home and say to my mother, I adored my grandmother. This was really, and my mother acknowledged that to her credit. She said, yes, I've seen that, and it's uncomfortable, it's unpleasant, but then we didn't go any further. I wanted it to be laid out very clinically, so you had to look at the data and the evidence and go, oh, even if at moments there was a certain gallows humor in it, this is particularly important in, something to be insisted upon, most particularly if you are a growing up girl. And these are traits, exaggerations and intensifications of things that I think a lot of women of any group will recognize in terms of fashion magazines and, hairstyles and pretty little noses and what. But if you were white, you were still white, even if you didn't have the exact nose. We were taking it for granted in some way that this was your world. So the backdrop of the appropriate look was you belong to a people who, many of whom are hopelessly beyond, without this appropriate look. And at any moment, you are constantly working to strive to not to have that look. So, and at any moment, something about your looks, your face, your body might slip back into that absolutely, irrefutably undesirable territory. So, was all very specific. At best, you looked essentially like a wasp. But there were also, there was a lot of room for the kind of Mediterranean or, perhaps Mexican or Latin American, that kind of look. That meant you could have curly hair if it was lustrous, sort of like Jane Russell's hair. Is that? Yeah, in fact, Jane Russell, that was a very good look. But, even nicer if you looked kind of like Grace Kelly. And, then your lips should not be, the lips we now see that are so popular, no. Those first came in, I think, with French movies because of Jean Moreau. But a Negro with full lips, which were always called thick, out of the question. A broad nose. Of course, I am a respectable light brown, but I am light brown. Then there are many shades below. My sister was several shades browner, and we were both extremely aware. Though this was not something my parents in particular were obsessive about. And again, geographical distinctions. My sister would swear that my parents' friends who'd come to Chicago from southern states like South Carolina or Virginia, they were the ones whom she was quite sure were a little nicer to me. And I don't think she was necessarily wrong at all. There were always comments in my home. There were always assessments being made in my home, in other homes. This is partly, it seems to me, this is bourgeois life. A bourgeoisie, call it a middle class, an upper middle class, an upper class, in some way, it is always policing its boundaries and borders. However those doctrines are passed on. They might be done very tastefully and subtly, or they might be quite bold, but that is the definition of hierarchical privilege and of class privilege. So those were the forms it took. Everything from who are his parents to, he's not very attractive, meaning, right.
Wow.
Right. Men always had it easier if they were achieving. You could be very brown and you could acquire, this is the male story, a much lighter wife, and attributes, accomplishment, education, a certain amount of money, good manners. It was also about how they carried themselves. Were they being suitably dignified, or at least, displaying their talent in a way that was not clownish? Yeah. But also, there weren't that many blacks in the 50s on TV. So it was also a mark of where are we going in the larger world? How are we being viewed? We got to see ourselves on the larger stage of American culture. Certainly people like the old-time movie people, like Stepin Fetchit or Manton Moreland. Hattie McDaniel, tricky. You could laugh, but it was very, very tricky. Sammy Davis Jr. was sometimes an embarrassment because when he got in, when he was playing around with Dean and Frank Sinatra and the boys, he could get very ingratiating. They pick him up, they tell strange little race jokes, and it was all, full of camaraderie, but he was more often the butt of the jokes, and he needed them. He needed them so much, and he always laughed harder than everybody else, Frank and Dean. No. Unless you are in a protected space, you are. And in an ironic and terrible way, politically, that's not so different from what I was saying a few minutes ago about, appearance. At any moment, something about your appearance could signal to someone who didn't like black people. Get them away. And but this person looks like this means, it's very much the same thing in a political and social and economic frame. And it happens to women too, and girls, not just guys. My mother and father instructed us, more my mother, because my father was at the office. But they instructed us basically in the navigation. There's certain rules. We, Denise and I, as children, we had to make up our own beds. In my mother's mind, it was partly an acknowledgement that she had had grandparents who had been in service in St. Louis to white families. But, she said to me once, I loved those women dearly. So she, a certain degree of politeness to her was a way of not betraying them. It's a small thing. It's better than nothing. But I wanted to, by exposing, documenting, analyzing the contradictions and the discomforts, but also the satisfactions and pleasures. I'm not a heroine. Right. I do some terribly snobbish things. I wanted to explore and expose and look at all of the. I wanted to really look at all the intricacies of privilege, especially privilege that it's asserting itself. I mean Negroland privilege, and yet it's provisional. And that also seems to me a very American.
Yes.
Even though I'm speaking about a very particular background, it seems to me a very American set of negotiations. And
right.
Even when there's not that much money involved, it is about, all the accoutrement of privilege. You have good manners. Maybe you come from a distinguished old family that's fallen on hard times. There's always some way to define it, to claim it, to insist on it, to display it. And all that, that is all fascinating to me. And how that lives on inside you as your circumstances change and how you struggle with it, or what parts of it, you kind of are content to live with. I wanted that series of dramas to be, and to make clear that you have the possessions, internal and external, necessary to get that recognition, that the perks, the respect. And, for us, there is this vast spectrum. You want the perks, you want it to be treated nicely in a restaurant, you want the saleswoman, if she's white or black, to be suitably deferential. Well, that's not deeply attractive, but there you are. But then, you keep going along the continuum. You want to be treated like a first-class citizen. You want just and honorable things as well. You want not to be closed out of a university because you're black. You want if you're a responsible political person, and there were those in Negroland, then you want better things, more social justice for blacks as a whole. So it runs from large and worthy things to petty. Great Uncle Lucius, I really knew very little about him until I knew nothing about him until I was in, I think, 5th grade. And my parents, at that point I was at a mostly white school, and there were a little cluster of blacks there. But I was already, having a little trouble negotiating, because one of my classmates, whom I'd assumed from her appearance was white, I suddenly realized was black when she and her parents showed up at the same events that my parents went to, and I knew their world of close friends was all black. And so, I was working this through. My parents suddenly announced that our great uncle, on my father's side, was coming over to dinner, and then they had to tell us that he had been passing as a white man all these years. Well, why was he coming back? And I don't know that the story all emerged at the same time, because we were very polite. It turned out Uncle Lucius had retired from his job. So he moved back into a black neighborhood. Now, over the years, periodically, Uncle Lucius had seen my father, and the negotiation was always their cousin Lillian, who was very fair. Uncle Lucius would get in touch with her. Then they'd probably meet at a white restaurant. Then she would call the darker members of the family, no doubt including his sister, and say, my great aunt, and say, someone would like to come visit you, or, Lucius is in town, will you be at your office? Or we'll come by the house. So Uncle Lucius came back. We had dinner with him. I really don't remember much else. I think we saw him a few more times. Then a few years later, my father said, Uncle Lucius has gotten so difficult. He's always calling and accusing all of his black relatives, his Negro relatives, Daddy would have said, of neglecting him. So I don't really, I didn't do this in the book, but the fact is, I don't really know when Uncle Lucius died or any such thing. There are a few pictures of him, but I don't remember much. What I do remember, which I think you want me to get to, is the premise of passing, which was accepted by these older generations. The premise was you are doing this because you are going to find more opportunities. You're in many practical ways, you will have a better life. So whether you are my uncle, my cousin, or my twin brother, and yes, there could be that too, I'm not going to tell. We're going to navigate this. And I'm proud of you in some way, actually. I have mixed feelings, but there is a pride. You pulled it off, you succeeded, and, it's always a way of showing, is whiteness. It's pretty ridiculous, isn't it, But my parents were actually a little disdainful of Uncle Lucius. Why? And here's where class comes in. In essence, they said, if you're going to bother to pass, Uncle Lucius had been a traveling salesman. You certainly need to be doing better. I'm a doctor. My brothers are judges. Traveling salesman in the family? There was another cousin who'd risen higher in the world. His name was, I just use initials. They called him John. John Eddie had been his southern name. I am sure when he moved into business in the North, he became John Edward. That's one. That's part of really the examining of the structures of, I hope, race, class, gender. But I also wanted to look at how an individual, how a particular life, it's mine, but any reader is bringing that particular life. Here it is on this, elaborate cultural, social, political map. How is one shaped? How are you made? How much freedom do you have to make yourself? To leave some of it behind, or not. I wanted that. What is it like, for a single psyche to engage with all of this? And yes, you're solitary. You're on your own, but the world is constantly making you. Your family, your larger group, your race, or your ethnicity, your class, your gender. How are you being made and unmade and remade, and what is the cost? Now, everybody has their own cost, but that was key, yeah. Every race, he says, has its, in essence, its superior class. No race is without its first-rate leaders, who basically, they're the ones, the group, the race, stakes it, or the nation, stakes its reputation on. And we too, we blacks too, he's writing this at the start of the 20th century, we have our talented tenth, and they are supposed to both exemplify intellectual, social accomplishment, moral, because he was a Victorian, and they are supposed to, by example but also through action, lead the race forward. Many years later, he delivered a speech to a posh black fraternity, which was a severe critique of this. He said, I didn't fully realize, though I wondered, how easily, these accomplishments, this privilege, this status that I'm talking about could turn inward, become narcissistic, and basically become a question of self-congratulation and self-satisfied advancement only for one's own. Some of them did. Not all of them. You know, Julian Bond died recently. But, you know, as a class, there's much to be criticized. And, you know, yet, as I say, there are things in that world that I love dearly and that it gave me. And I can't lie about that and be virtuous. At the cost of honesty. But yes, in crucial ways, they dropped the ball or turned away from the ball to pursue their own lives. I've found that as an adult, of course, but it resonated with me because the passage goes on to talk about how the parents, and again, this is something that spreads out to, you know, any family in which older generations have had great great suffering, a real burden of historical oppression, suffering, whatever. How does this pass itself on to the child? And what? And often it's unconscious, but every parent, James Weldon Johnson says, has to think about how much you spare the Negro child, the full knowledge of the burdens of discrimination, oppression, hatred, and how much you prepare them. And he said either course, you know, chosen badly, can lead to, and he uses the phrase, spiritual disaster for the child. And you know, and I you know, there are so many of us, and I don't only mean blacks, though that's what I'm writing about in this book, you know, with these historical legacies burdens, that we, and burdens that our parents have perhaps imposed too much on us. You know, the parent who talks no, you're that, believe me, this is what these people will do, that, no. Or, you know, I had a friend, the child of Holocaust survivors, whose mother used to lock herself in the bathroom and threaten to kill herself regularly. You know, what do you do with these things? What do you make of them? And what do they make of you? But the other thing is, you know, how do the parents have had to, they've inherited that from their parents. So they are negotiating constantly with these legacies and with the possibility, as they see you navigating, of spiritual disaster for themselves too. So it's very complicated and kind of heartbreaking. I mean, I'm thinking less about myself at that moment than about my parents. Even if the parent has been relatively sheltered, if they know the history of their people, you know, then that's there. Also, where is the child growing up? You know, how are the threats constituting themselves even in that? You know, as long as your status, your protections are not secure, you know, that burden, that trauma. I am amazed that hasn't. I think more psychoanalysts maybe have been working on that than we think. But I'm amazed that hasn't been talked about much more in terms of, you know, the history of oppressed groups. You know, again, it's a good question to ask coming out of, you know, the James Weldon Johnson quote and what we were just talking about, this complex balance of protection and preparation. Warning. James Blake, I can't address. You know, interestingly to me, the newspapers were identifying him as biracial, which he is, but that's quite recent that they use that identification. He's been described as black before, or African American, so that's a small thing. I don't know what he was taught or not, but once you also become a celebrity, you know, you are living in a very sheltered world. So hard to say, very, very hard to say. It's going to be more of a shock. The more protections you've had, you know, the more shocking it's going to be, because some part of you, whatever you're being taught, you know, in school, by your parents, some part of you, there's the child in you that's always been protected. And some part of you is going to think, surely this will not stop. And that is not a criticism of James Blake. That's just, what? Yeah, I mean, I know I'd still have that reaction to, what are you, some part of me would be saying, look, look at me, look at how, what? Would you listen to how I'm talking? What? My parents put me in a progressive, very good, largely, but not wholly, white school when I was in kindergarten. In a certain way, again, it was within its limitations, progressive. They didn't suddenly send me to the equivalent of the military academy. There was a space in that school, and there was a space in that school where 4- and 5-year-olds were making friends. There were moments. There were, my book is partly about those disconnects and dissonances, but there was some space for something that I would call taking each other for granted as personalities. We all knew we were very smart. We all knew we were being cosseted and treated well because of that, and trained, and in that way, pampered. So, that was a certain ground of privilege we shared. But naturalness is what I would say when you can start very early in as generous an environment as society will permit at that point. That already, and that was something my parents chose, gave me a comfort level, which is a form of wiliness, to move into the world with. They made sure that we, got all the cultural pleasures and rewards and duties. Every child doesn't want to take ballet lessons or, whatever. But they wanted us, all of this, to feel, like part of our world and like our legacy, our lineage. They had to balance it with making sure we got enough black history. And they had their own, they were much more suspicious of white individual people with good reason. Their history had been different. But they also, my parents, there were things that they just loved. My mother probably could have been a writer, and she read to me all the time, and all about books and love literature. My father had been a jazz musician and a classical musician in college and grad school, so these, jazz was my legacy. Going to the symphony was my legacy too. Of course, I'm simplifying it or prettifying it a bit, but they made sure we had all those things. They had both grown up with less money and less access. Their parents were very ambitious, but and had both my grandmothers had gone to a little black school in the South, but everything was much more difficult. And they sheltered us and prepared us in the best way. I'll tell you it's a gender story from my father. This shows you the meticulousness. He said at one point to my mother, she told me this years later, it's important that we make sure and take the girls out regularly to very nice restaurants, because when they are old enough to have boyfriends and suitors, I don't want them being so naive that they're blown off their feet. You take what you take for granted makes you wily, doesn't it? Even as it can also make you naive and somewhat spoiled. And I was not exempt from both those things. But also the insistence that we achieve, and did help somewhat. Did stop us from being total brats, I think. Well, we could be heading economically in this country, economically and politically, for just major 20 years, I can't say. What has happened, Negroland has integrated a great deal, and that really started in the late 60s, when suddenly job opportunities and training programs opened up for particularly, blacks, privileged blacks. So there could be, a citizen of Negroland who is, the head of American Express or blah, blah, blah. It's really expanded its reach in terms of being a portion, a population, a world within what one might call white land. Michelle Obama, when she was growing up in what was a very solid, working class, lower middle class family, no. But, the world being what it is, we know perfectly well that once Michelle and her brother got to Princeton, and once she got very good jobs in Chicago, when you say interacting with, no, we were given, I see what you mean. I was thinking at first, do you mean the ones I was going, say, to school with, or the larger, more hostile world of white people? We were given, particularly as we got older each year, and particularly as adolescence approached, we were given, talks, warnings. Some of them took the form of, white people will always think, therefore you must behave well. The piano teacher who enters about 5 of us into some national piano teachers contest, you must all play very well because these teachers expect nothing of you. We're getting that. You're also overhearing these talks, So it's a combination of all the things you are taught and the urgency of them, and then those turn into specific warnings. And then as adolescence comes, everyone is worried about interracial and sometimes, intra-religious dating, and I think all the parents of everyone at my school, but certainly not least the black parents, were sending out intense warnings. Be careful, keep your distance, You are constantly being prepared, but some of it is not spoken. It's just the intensity, of your manners and of the demands placed on you. This book is partly a record of many little shocks. They're not all huge, but to a child, they are. Not the inward, subtler things, again, because of the particular protections. But yeah, there are always a series of shocks. Yes.
Great question.
And then how much do you tell your parents, or when do you decide to hide that yourself and grapple? Yeah. They'd be more frightened for him, and also they'd be more frightened for him in the white world, and they'd be more frightened that he might be tempted, by an unsuccessful Jay-Z, by the glamour. This is how they would have put it, by the glamour of the ghetto, and that he would sort of start going. But, boys had more license, so they'd be afraid both of his possible actions and of perceptions. Yeah. My mother spoke a lot like I do, though I had a little career in the theater, so that may have done. But she had a wonderful ear. She could bring a kind of genteel southernness into it. My father had a slight, just easy southern accent. Chicago is full of people who immigrated from all manner of places, so you get a lot. I would say my parents, having grown up much more in black worlds, were much better at moving between black vernacular and standardized English than either my sister or I. But it's the way we were brought up. So-called standardized English was what we spoke, and it wasn't surprising to me. America is so riddled with, and it's not just America, my God, but it has always been, hierarchical, class-based. Though it's always pretending not to be. I mean, America is so strange. You can become Donald Trump, whether it's money or other kinds of power. No, that's what this country is. So, I'm not surprised at all. And there isn't any group, some of whose members haven't grasped for that and found it and don't use it.